At this point, I would like to take note of the fact that I recognize many of these quotes are taken from larger bodies of work. I read those larger bodies of work. None of the quotes that I am presenting to you right now are taken out of context or selectively released. None of the speeches that I write out to you have ellipses between them to remove sentences that are inconvenient to me. All of these are descriptive of the positions of these theorists at the time they wrote them.
Hi there. Vaush recently made a video claiming that Marx, Lenin, and co. would support Biden in the upcoming US election. He claims to have shown this by quoting them himself. Let's take a look at what he says, then. Firstly, clarifying my own position, it's essentially the same as Lenin's: strategic participation in electoralism for revolutionary parties in order to show the futility of electoralism with a prime focus on actual organizing activities. Apparently, he's gotten a lot of people telling him to read more theory. Why is theory important? Well, in a quick sentence, a lot of the analysis has already been done. That doesn't mean you can't disagree or add on to it, but essentially you'll get more fruitful discussion when everyone is informed on positions that have already been cleared up a century ago, rather than blindly wading through all of it yourself. A radical not reading the works of predecessors is just as much a failure as book worship is. Anywho, he claims to have read theory now, so let's see what he has to say. The fundamental position that led to the entire video is Vaush's belief that Biden is supposedly superior to Trump. I won't comment, as I'm not in the US. As an Iraqi, though, my personal experience is that both are equally trash. There is no lesser evil here. Both Democrats and Republicans thoroughly enjoyed bombing my country. I'll talk about this a little more towards the end. Let's get to the meat of the video.
The passages in dispute dealt with the British Communist parties and declared that they should affiliate with the British Labour Party and make use of parliamentary action. Lenin evidently does not regard either of these questions as fundamental. Indeed, he considers that they are not question of principles at all, but of tactics, which may be employed advantageously in some phases of the changing situation and discarded with advantage in others.
His first quoting of Lenin is out of context. He didn't even read the whole passage, which continues, "The passages in dispute dealt with the British Communist parties and declared that they should affiliate to the British Labour Party and make use of parliamentary action. Lenin evidently does not regard either of these questions as fundamental. Indeed, he considers that they are not questions of principle at all, but of tactics, which may be employed advantageously in some phases of the changing situation and discarded with advantage in others. Neither question, in his opinion, is important enough to cause a split in the communist ranks. I'm even inclined to suspect that he has not been uninfluenced by the belief that the course he has chosen is that which will appeal to the majority of communists, and will therefore cement the largest number of them in united action. As to the question of affiliation to the Labour Party, a question that may presently arise in similar forms for decision by the Communist parties of Canada and the United States, Lenin says, millions of backward members are enrolled in the Labour Party, therefore communists should be present to do propaganda amongst them, provided communist freedom of action and propaganda is not thereby limited. When afterwards, in the Kremlin, I argued with Lenin privately that the disadvantages of affiliation outweigh those of disaffiliation, he dismissed the subject as unimportant, saying that the Labour Party would probably refuse to accept the Communist Party's affiliation, and that, in any case, the decision could be altered next year. As you can see, this is discussing the participation of communist parties, not the Democrats. Even if you were to appeal to the fact that it's coordinated action between communist parties and the British Labour Party, you cannot ignore that the principal ingredient, we can say, is the presence of the Communist Party. Secondly, the British Labour Party was far more radical than it is now, and the comparison is just inadequate. I'm not talking a degree or two, I mean far more radical than any left party in the vicinity of power in the imperial core.
But you don't just need to hear it from Lenin, how about we hear it from Engels? For us, absenteeism from elections is impossible. We seek the abolition of classes. What is the means of achieving it? The political domination of the proletariat. Revolution is the supreme act of politics. Whoever wants it must also want the means, political action, which prepares for it, which gives the workers the education for revolution, and without which the workers will always be duped. So Engels argued that mobilizing through bourgeois electoralism was a mechanism by which the proletariat could be educated on the circumstances of the class consciousness.
He's taken Engels out of context with this quote. Again, this would be evident if he quoted the entire passage, which I'll do in a second. Interestingly, Vaush outed himself as not actually having read theory here, and just quote mining. I know this because this quote is a garbled mess of a speech Engels gave titled Apropos of Working Class Political Action. The version of the quote he got is, word for word, a summary from this article from the International Socialist Review. If he actually would have read the work himself, he would have quickly seen that, like Lenin, Engels advocated for voting for a workers' party, not a bourgeois democratic party. Engels says, however, our politics must be working class politics. The Workers' Party must never be the tail of any bourgeois party. It must be independent and have its goal and its own policy. Engels also says that, in a supremely political moment like it was at the time, to preach abstention to them is to throw them into the embrace of bourgeois politics. Ironically, today we can turn the statement on its head and say that Vaush's push for people to participate is doing the exact same thing, throwing them into the embrace of bourgeois politics. Engels' point in the speech isn't that we should participate in bourgeois politics. It is that we should coordinate voting for revolutionary working class parties along with strikes, protests, direct action, and a general strategy for revolution.
That is not the only thing Engels wrote on this subject. And if universal suffrage had offered no other advantage than that it allowed us to count our numbers every 3 years, in America 4, that by the regularity established, unexpectedly rapid rise in our vote, it increased in equal measure the workers' certainty of victory and the dismay of their opponents, and so became our best means of propaganda, that it accurately informed us of our own strength and that of all other opposing parties, and thereby provided us with a measure of proportion second to none for our actions, safeguarding us from untimely timidity as much as from untimely foolhardiness. If that had been the only advantage we gained from the suffrage, it would have still been more than enough, but it did more than this by far. In election propaganda, it provided us with a means, second to none, of getting in touch with the mass of the people where they still stand aloof from us, of forcing all parties to defend their views and actions against our attacks. Does that remind you at all of what the Justice Squad, the Justice Dems, and what Bernie Sanders have done to the rest of the Democrats? And further, it provided our representatives in the Reichstag with a platform from which they could speak to their opponents in Parliament and to the masses outside with quite a different authority and freedom than in the press or at meetings.
This second quote from Engels, too, he seems to not actually have read, but instead Googled for and found in, again, an International Socialist Review article. If you're going to try to back up your points from Marx, Lenin, etc., at least read what they said. Don't go quote mining. What especially annoys me is that the article he's taking these quotes from even states that Marx and Engels aren't promoting what he's promoting. In fact, it even says at the beginning, throughout their political lives, Marx and Engels always argued that the working class, whatever its size and state of development, must organize itself independently as a class and consequently into a political party. Not join with the Democrats as Vaush is suggesting. Moving on to the quote itself, Engels is talking about a radical socialist party, not lesser evilism. A party with powerful revolutionary trends too, not just your run-of-the-mill central-left European party. He thoroughly misunderstood a quote that is explained a paragraph later. This has to be intentional, I think. Either that, or he genuinely misunderstood what the quote was. If that was the case, why is he talking so authoritatively about something he clearly doesn't understand? Furthermore, the very same article he's ripping from goes on to specifically say, in his advice to socialists in the United States, Engels emphasized the importance of them supporting and participating in any movement of the working class that, whatever its limitations, would help it to develop its own independent political party. Within the specific American context, Engels promoted working class party action, not the Democrats. Like all other Marxists, Engels is for the position of working class parties participating in elections along with the real meat of the movement, direct action.
There's one more segment that I would like to read here, which is a part of the Theses on Communist Parties and Parliamentarism, which was, again, they probably don't care about this person, in part a product of Trotsky. The fact that Parliament is an institution of the bourgeois state can in no way be used as an argument against participating in the parliamentary struggle. The Communist Party does not enter these institutions in order to work as an integral part of them. Rather, it does so to use Parliament to help the masses take action to break up the state machine and the Parliament itself.
The use of this third quote confuses me. It so clearly states something so antithetical to what he's advocating for, but he doesn't see it. The quote itself literally says, the Communist Party does not enter these institutions in order to work as an integral part of them. Rather, it does so to use Parliament to help the masses take action to break up the state machine and the Parliament itself. The Communist Party. the Communist Party, not the Democrats, and no lesser evilism. Using this to justify voting for Biden is just so poorly thought out, it's almost funny. How is voting for Biden going to break up the state machine and the parliament itself? Also, he probably got this quote from elsewhere, as the wording is different from the usual source people go to read theory from, the Marxist Internet Archive. The quote there is, "The rostrum of the bourgeois parliament is such an auxiliary base. The argument that parliament is a bourgeois state institution cannot at all be used against participation in the parliamentary struggle. The Communist Party does not enter these institutions in order to carry out organic work there, but in order to help the masses from inside parliament to break up the state machine and parliament itself through action. For example, the activity of Liebknecht in Germany," and the quote goes on. This makes me think that he just got it from elsewhere like the other quotes and didn't actually bother to read any theory. It's pretty funny that he considered this video to be the end of the discussion. He goes on to talk about how it'll do us good to participate in order to judge our numbers, deliver arguments to enemies, etc. That's all well and good if it was a race between a Communist Party and the Republicans, not the Republicans or Democrats. He's arguing two different and somewhat opposing points here. The first being that Biden is the lesser evil and that it'll do better for the radical left if he wins, and second, that participating in elections helps the movement for the reasons mentioned above. This is all just an incoherent mess.
Did you know Marx actually believed it was possible to achieve socialism peacefully through democracy and through voting? A quote from him in his La Liberté speech. "You know that the institutions, mores, and traditions of various countries must be taken into consideration, and we do not deny that there are countries, such as America, England, and if I were more familiar with your institutions, I would perhaps also add Holland, where the workers can attain their goal by peaceful means. That being the case, we must also recognize the fact that in most countries on the continent, the lever of our revolution must be force. It is force to which we must one day appeal in order to erect the rule of labor."
The next quote by Marx is somewhat silly, as it doesn't really support his argument. Marx didn't say voting anywhere. Also, we're materialists as Marxists. Our decisions should be dictated by an analysis of the material conditions. If the material conditions of the movement lead to the seizure of political power by the working class peacefully, then alhamdulillah, why not? Historically, though, we have seen that peaceful transition of power is not much more than a pipe dream. Vaush challenges those that say that Marx wasn't talking about voting here, asking rhetorically, in what way could the working class gain power aside from democracy? This just shows Vaush's lack of creativity, if anything. Dual power, maybe? With participation of the military, like in the Bolshevik Revolution? A peaceful takeover can occur when the repressive arms of the state refuse to be so any longer. Unlikely, but it has happened here or there. Bourgeois democracy isn't the only thing meant here, and voting for the Democrats sure as hell isn't going to result in a peaceful transition to socialism, even though he isn't arguing this point. I hope. This leads to another point that, hey, Marx could be wrong at that one instance. He isn't a prophet. He was wrong in other things. He was just a man that analyzed the situation and came to a particular conclusion. In other instances, he believes it can happen by force. Unsurprisingly, it changed based on the conditions. Regardless, we're not talking about a peaceful transition to socialism here. We're talking about voting for Biden. This point doesn't support any of his arguments. Also, I believe, although I may be mistaken, that Vaush didn't advocate for a revolution. So why does all of this matter? This makes his point even more moot than before, even if his out-of-context quote mining didn't do that already. He goes on to requote that same quote from before about Lenin's conversation with Pankhurst, and again grossly misrepresents Lenin's opinion. He tries to justify this by saying that a Biden presidency would have a higher likelihood of radicalizing Democrats. How? Honestly, how? He claims that people currently view the failings of capitalism as the failings of Trump, rather than capitalism itself. Somehow, Biden, as president, will change that and cast light upon those blinded by Trump's incompetence to see that it truly, like a bad Scooby-Doo episode, was capitalism behind it all along. That's all fair and good, but what stopped them from being radicalized when Obama was in office, or Clinton, or any other Democrat? This is a point so badly substantiated it barely requires to be mentioned, but it's done nonetheless. Again, it doesn't matter to me. My personal experience as someone on the receiving end of American imperialism has been that both are equally bad, and there are no lesser evils when it comes to American presidents. Also, about infiltrating the Democrats, you do realize that capital is still in power in the US, right? They'll shoot you like they shot Luxembourg and Leibniz before you ever have a chance at destabilizing capitalism, or the power of the bourgeoisie in the United States. Infiltration within the Democrats is more of a conservative, evil, Jewy commies trying to get rid of our freedoms argument than any actual strategy. Again, Lenin advocated this in a party far more radical than the Democrats, one that represented the workers, so to speak. The Democrats objectively don't. So what exactly are you advocating for?
But, Lenin, listen to this. If the Hendersons and the Snowdens, leaders of the Labor Party, reject a bloc with the communists, the latter will immediately gain by winning the sympathy of the masses and discrediting the Hendersons and the Snowdens. If, as a result, we do lose a few parliamentary seats, it is a matter of no significance to us. So by working with the Labor Party, if we are rejected for being too radical, we will earn the sympathy of the masses by showing that the bourgeois-interested Labor Party is not interested in accepting the perspectives of genuine far-left radicals. We would put up our candidates in a very few but absolutely safe constituencies, namely constituencies where our candidatures would not give any seats to the liberals at the expense of the Labor candidates. We would take part in the election campaign, distribute leaflets agitating for communism, and in all constituencies where we have no candidates, we would urge the electors to vote for the Labor candidate and against the bourgeois candidate.
His quotation of Lenin, supposedly advocating for what he claims he advocates for here, is, again, completely misunderstood in its specific context. It specifically highlights voting for the Labor candidate against the bourgeois candidate, not the bourgeois candidate against the bourgeois candidate, like what is happening in the US right now. You aren't present in the Democrats in large numbers. You aren't advocating for communism or revolution. All this does is push electoralism further down the road. Again, this strategy would be valid if there was an active and present Communist Party whose neglect by the liberal bourgeois establishment would elicit sympathy for it. This doesn't exist in the US. The correct policy would be to establish working class groups and to radicalize within your own communities right now, not be in bed with the Democrats. The Black Panthers gave American leftists the best blueprint for radicalization in the US. If you believe the establishment would never let that happen again, how do you delude yourself into thinking infiltrating the Democrats will be allowed instead?
After all, the German lefts cannot but know that the entire history of Bolshevism, both before and after the October Revolution, get this, is full of instances of changes in tack, conciliatory tactics, and compromises with other parties, including bourgeois parties. So this lays clear a distinction that others might find as an excuse to ignore these arguments. Lenin advocates not just for working with reformist parties, but even at times bourgeois parties, which the Democrat and Republican parties both are to varying extents and in different ways.
He continues to mention that Lenin said both before and after the October Revolution is full of instances of changes of tack, conciliatory tactics, and compromises with other parties, including bourgeois parties. Vaush, interestingly, doesn't mention that Lenin was talking about these conciliatory tactics and compromises happening between the Bolsheviks and these other groups, meaning a revolutionary working class party drawing concessions with certain bourgeois groups. The failure in understanding seems to be the same in each quote. All these misquoted bits of text come from the same fundamental position, that there is a communist party or other working class organization of some form that is present, active, and attempting to increase its reach. This does not exist within the United States. He reads these quotes, but doesn't seem to actually understand what is being said. Call it selective hearing, call it liberalism, whatever you call it, it's a wrong reading of Lenin, plain and simple.
I'd like to read out one more second, this time from Engels. In England, France, and Belgium, where the bourgeoisie rules, keep in mind this was like 140 years ago, the communists still have a common interest with the various democratic parties, an interest which is all the greater the more closely the socialistic measures they champion approach the aims of the communists. That is, the more clearly and definitely they represent the interests of the proletariat and the more they depend on the proletariat for support. In England, for example, the working class Chartists are infinitely closer to the communists than the democratic petty bourgeoisie or the so-called radicals. The Chartists were a workers' labor movement. In America, where a democratic constitution has already been established, the communists must make the common cause with the party which will turn this constitution against the bourgeoisie and use it in the interests of the proletariat. That is, with the agrarian national reformers. He is actually advocating for communists to throw their weight not behind communist parties, but behind parties which best represent the proletarian interest.
Continuing this trend, he yet again completely misunderstands Engels, even going as far as to say that Engels advocated for communists to not throw their weight behind communist parties, but parties that best represent the proletarian interest. Vaush, read the quote again, for the love of God. Engels specifically says the communists still have a common interest with the various Democratic Party, meaning an organization of communists, not individual communists. He's advocating for communist groups and parties to back certain other parties at specific times in strategic movements to further the revolutionary cause. Also, the point about England in comparison to the US, where a democratic constitution was already established, Engels is referring to monarchy versus a republic. This leads to points about bourgeois democratic revolutions as opposed to proletarian democratic revolutions, something he misunderstands when he quotes Mao, but I'll get to that soon. Again, how this supports your point about voting for Biden, I don't understand. By the way, he didn't read The Principles of Communism, the work being cited. How do I know this? Well, he didn't know who the agrarian national reformers were. Now, that's not too big of a deal. Lack of knowledge of obscure American politics from a century ago isn't a crime. But there's only one real source for reading theory aside from print, and that is the Marxist Internet Archive. It's the easiest source to get to, and also one with full explanations in the margins, or the notes. Our best friend as Marxists, really. For this particular work, the Marxist Internet Archive has a footnote that reads, probably a reference to the National Reform Association founded during the 1840s by George H. Evans, with headquarters in New York City, which has for its motto, vote yourself a farm. I have a very hard time believing he read this elsewhere, and the few other websites I checked that have this work also include a footnote. So, either he didn't read it, most likely, or skimmed it and didn't bother looking at the footnotes, which, how serious of a study was it in that case? He claims to have read all these the night before, claiming he forgot is just bad form, even if it were true. Going by the other misquoted segments, though, it's most likely he didn't seriously read any work, and most likely just quote-mined. His point on unions, though, I agree on. His understanding of dual power, though, is iffy. Labor unions weren't the locus of dual power. Soviets within Russia and Red bases, established by Red Army military action in China, were the locus. Yes, labor unions played a part, but claiming that building unions going to build dual power is misguided and a little naive, to say the least.
Who are angry and very impotently enraged at the fact that I have actually read the theory that you haven't, and have now arrived at conclusions that you are uncomfortable with. I'm sorry. Maybe you shouldn't have asked me to read theory, because I wanted to play video games last night, but here I am, and now I know more.
Alright, at this point, he's so smug about reading a few hours of theory, which he didn't, by the way, completely misrepresenting and misunderstanding it, and then parading around like he's won a victory for himself. This is just childish, honestly. Also, claiming others haven't read theory when you yourself haven't is pretty rich. Look, advocate for Biden and the Democrats if you want to, I don't care. Just don't pretend you read Lenin, because you so obviously haven't. His take on increased sophistication, precluding old theorists from understanding modern conditions, is misguided. That's why Marxism is a constantly developing science. Lenin built on Marx, Mao built on Lenin. Countless hundreds have built on our understanding of finance capital and imperialism, capitalist hegemony, political strategy in the 21st century, concepts of labor aristocracy and unequal exchange, on and on. You synthesize these positions into a coherent ideology when you continually study. That's why theory is good, because many of the conclusions you'd reach have already been reached decades ago. Rejecting it is like a medical student rejecting medical textbooks for figuring it out on their own. His take on old-form revolutions being impossible is misguided. This video is long enough already, so check out my video titled How Rich Countries Rob the Poor, the Failure of Social Democracy for more information. Most of his points are built on the misunderstandings of the choice selections of quotes he's made, so essentially his arguments fall apart, for the most part. They can be standalone, without appealing to Marx and Lenin. Hell, I'd prefer that. Using Lenin as a base to say something Lenin never advocated for, though, that ruins your argument.
Trump represents a severe threat to our democracy, far more so than a traditional bourgeois reactionary president. Far more so than Biden, far more so than Bush. A significantly greater threat to our democracy. For, and I will list now a short number of the reasons why I believe this. A complete ideological control of his political party, a violent, zealous, and cult-like fan base, his brazen electoral interference from which he is apparently insulated from any legal consequence, his open disdain for any checks and balances on his power, a cult of personality which is akin at this point nearly to a private army, an apparent impunity to legal reprimand, a constant reference to the viability of removing term limits, openly promoting conspiracy theories about his political opponents, up to including conspiracy theories which he believes justifies his perpetuation in office as a second term. He promotes far-right and fascist political perspectives. He constantly threatens free speech and media transparency. He is openly willing to use the threat of branding us as a terrorist group to attack not only
his list on why Trump is a bigger threat to our democracy could easily have been applied to Nixon, or Reagan, or even fucking Woodrow Wilson. Do I need to remind you of the Palmer raids? Trump deployed the repressive arm of the state at a time when the rule of capital could be shaken, and somehow this makes Biden a better candidate. You don't think in the same position Biden would do the same? The greatest suppression of civil rights activists and the assassination of Martin Luther King was under Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democrat. The destruction of the Black Panther Party and the murder and imprisonment of its leaders also happened under a Democrat president. To claim that somehow a Democrat will have more respect for democratic institutions or whatever other liberal nonsense is not only naive, it's just wrong. History has proven otherwise. As Marxists, we realize that, like most things, under capitalism, all we have are concessions. If capital would benefit from an autocratic takeover, then that's what the bourgeoisie and the repressive arms would do. One of Vaush's fundamental arguments, that Trump's presence will remove criticism from capitalism and onto Trump's own incompetence, followed with a Biden presidency that would somehow open the eyes of liberals and allow for further radicalization, is just plain silly. I reiterate my previous point. How? Why didn't this happen in previous presidencies? Are you really that sure that the average white American liberal can exit the hyper-individualist mind prison they've been confined to simply because Trump is gone? What's stopping them from thinking that future's failures and inadequacies are a result of Biden's dementia, or whatever else, rather than capitalism itself? This point is at best a shot in the dark with little evidence to back it up.
Now, how would you feel if I told you that conditionally the old leftist theorists were in favor of the promotion of capitalism and bourgeois democracy as an alternative to complete autocracy? I read from you now a segment written by Mao Zedong. If any communist or communist sympathizer talks about socialism and communism but fails to fight for this objective, if he belittles this bourgeois democratic revolution, relaxes or slows down ever so slightly, and shows the least disloyalty and coolness, or is reluctant to shed his blood or give his life for it, then wittingly or unwittingly, such a person is betraying socialism and communism to a greater or lesser extent, and is certainly not a politically conscious and staunch fighter for communism. I noticed this in a lot of what I read from Mao, by the way. Mao was very big on the fight and die kind of talk, quite a bit more than Lenin and Marx. It is a law of Marxism that socialism can be attained only via the stage of democracy. And in China, the fight for democracy is a protracted one. It would be a sheer illusion to try to build a socialist society on the ruins of the colonial, semi-colonial, and semi-feudal order without a united, new democratic state, without the development of a state sector of the new democratic economy, of the private capitalist and cooperative sectors, and of national, scientific, and mass culture, i.e. a new democratic mass culture, and without the liberation and the development of the individuality of hundreds of millions of people. In short, without a thoroughgoing bourgeois democratic revolution of a new type, led by the Communist Party.
Again, the quote itself refutes his position. He seems to have completely missed, although he did in fact read the segment. In short, without a thoroughgoing bourgeois democratic revolution of a new type led by the Communist Party, Mao isn't supporting bourgeois democracy. He's supporting new democracy. This is what not reading theory does to you. He completely misunderstands what new democracy is and is assuming it's just plain old liberal democratic bullshit when it isn't. All of this is valid only under the presumption that there exists a communist party in the leading position, a people's army with control of large areas of land, and a massive movement capable and willing to overthrow the current order so that they can begin the construction of socialism. All of this within a country that is agrarian and semi-feudal in development, not the highly industrialized and wealthy United States. None of these conditions exist in the US. Putting aside the fact that Vaush doesn't understand what a bourgeois democratic revolution is, he's also incorrectly applying this quote from 1945 China to the modern United States, despite Mao talking about a necessary stage of development of the Chinese Revolution in which foreign domination and imperialism is overthrown and a connection with the national bourgeoisie is made. This leads into a discussion of the development of socialism within agrarian semi-feudal nations, which is outside the scope of this video. Nothing about quoting this is valid. It doesn't support his position on Biden, it cannot be applied to the modern American situation, and most importantly of all, it doesn't say what Vaush thinks it says. What Mao was saying was valid when these conditions existed. Number 1, the Japanese aggressors have not yet been defeated. Number 2, the Chinese people urgently need to work together for a democratic change in order to achieve national unity, rapidly mobilize and unite all anti-Japanese forces, and defeat the Japanese aggressors in cooperation with the Allies. And 3, the Kuomintang government is disrupting national unity and obstructing such a democratic change. This is a direct quote from the work Vaush is citing. To support the unity of political groups with the Communist Party in the leadership position during a combined civil war and war of attrition against a foreign fascist power with the goal of forming a new republic with the explicit goal of building socialism, all of this is in the work, people, cannot in any way be applied to the modern US. So either he didn't read it and just ripped this quote in a bad attempt to substantiate his argument, or he read it only partially, or read it and misunderstood it so badly as to mangle it into a position in support of Biden. Please, I ask everyone, go and read the works yourselves. They're not that long, honestly.
From Engels in The Principles of Communism. In Germany, finally, the decisive struggle now on the order of the day is between the bourgeoisie and the absolute monarchy. Since the communists cannot enter upon the decisive struggle between themselves and the bourgeoisie until the bourgeoisie is in power, it follows that it is in the interest of the communists to help the bourgeoisie to power as soon as possible, in order the sooner to be able to overthrow it. Against the governments, therefore, the communists must continually support the radical liberal party, taking care to avoid the self-deceptions of the bourgeoisie and not fall for the enticing promises of benefits which a victory for the bourgeoisie would allegedly bring the proletariat. The sole advantages which the proletariat would derive from a bourgeoisie victory would consist in 1. In various concessions which would facilitate the unification of the proletariat into a close-knit, battle-worthy, and organized class, and 2. In the certainty that, on the very day the absolute monarchies fall, the struggle between the bourgeoisie and proletariat will start. From that day on, the policy of the communists will be the same as it is now in the countries where the bourgeoisie is already in power.
His next quote from Engels' Principles of Communism, again, isn't saying what he thinks it's saying. This is talking about transition from absolute monarchy to bourgeois democracy, much like what happened in February of 1917 in Russia. The quote, yet again, refutes what he's saying. He even reads the part out. The sole advantages which the proletariat would derive from a bourgeois victory would consist of 1. In various concessions which would facilitate the unification of the proletariat into a closely knit, battle-worthy, and organized class, and 2. In the certainty that on the very day the absolute monarchies fall, the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat will start. From that day on, the policy of the communists will be the same as it is now in the countries where the bourgeoisie is already in power. Within the US, the bourgeoisie is already in power. This quote is against the old-style aristocracy and monarchic systems, not Trump. With Trump in power, the bourgeoisie is in power as well. People forget that he's a face and that American democracy is a farce. Stop looking at individuals and look at the systems as a whole. To claim that Biden would help radicalize is like claiming Bernie will bring socialism. There's no evidence that a Biden presidency will result in a closely knit, battle-worthy, and organized class. Firstly, this would require a working class party in the first place, and not the Democrats. But more importantly, if Democrats in power would have resulted in this, it wouldn't have taken until now. I get it, we're all young, so Trump seems like the worst thing in forever, but people forget what Reagan was like, for example. After his catastrophic presidency for the working class, no massive wave of radicalization followed. Not with Clinton, not with Obama, and certainly not with Biden. All evidence to the contrary has simply been weak rhetoric at this point.
And finally, the sentiment here is best described in a summary of Marx and Engels' perspective on voting in bourgeois elections, written by Duncan Hallis in a 1983 publication of the Socialist Review. In a sentence, we are for the defense of bourgeois democracy, more precisely the defense of democratic rights, against attacks from the right.
The final quote, appropriately, was not from Marx, Lenin, or anyone else of note, but from Duncan Hallis, the noteworthy theorist and sixth head right next to Mao. That's sarcasm, if you missed it. This is a Trotskyist in a split of a party that has done nothing for Marxist theory and belongs to a party with at best a few hundred members. Nonetheless, if someone's right, they're right, so let's take a look at what the full pamphlet says, shall we? The famous picture of the commune state painted by Marx in the Civil War in France, the suppression of the standing army, the armed people, all officials paid the average worker's wage, all important ones elected and subject to recall at any time, represents the considered view of Marx and Engels in their later years, of the essential instrument for the transition to socialism. All subsequent genuine Marxism is anti-statist. In this context, meaning the Civil War in France, Engels' remark that universal suffrage within the framework of the bourgeois state cannot and never will be more than a gauge of the maturity of the working class becomes perfectly clear. Electoral activity then came to mean seeking to win a parliamentary majority to administer capitalism, of course more humanely, efficiently, or whatever. Now comes the short bit Vaush quoted. We are for the defense of bourgeois democracy, more precisely the defense of democratic rights against attacks from the right. I wonder why he stopped the quote there. Let's continue. We are, in principle, in favor of electoral activity, but only as a subordinate form of activity, only as an auxiliary to direct working class action, never as an end in itself. We are for workers' power on the basis of the direct rule of working class organizations, whatever specific form this may take. This involves far more elections, but on a new basis. The abolition of state power is the goal of all socialists, including and above all Marx, declared the resolution cited above. Unless this goal is reached, true democracy, that is equality and freedom, is not attainable. And the road of the abolition of state power is the road of revolution and the commune state, not the road of reformist electoralism. This entire pamphlet, although committing some mistakes in my opinion, is advocating for working class organizations carrying out direct action mainly, with electoralism as an auxiliary method, with the final goal being revolution and the formation of a commune state similar to the Paris Commune. In contrast, Vaush here is advocating for participation in the Democrats, noted working class organization of course, voting for Biden, and not much else, direct action, at least in this video, and not advocating for revolution. In fact, just the opposite. He outright rejects revolution as a viable strategy, essentially damning himself to the same reformist electoralism that Duncan Hall has condemned. This pamphlet stands completely against Vaush, not with him. How he can quote in full dishonesty theory that goes directly against his positions and selectively presents them to his audience is baffling to me. It's the same issue over and over again. The fundamental position all of this arises from is the presence and activity of a working class organization. If one doesn't exist, you don't run to the Democrats, you make your own organizations. Educate, agitate, and organize within your own communities. Final point. I get it. To many, reading theory is a meme, but you really should read theory. Vaush hasn't. In fact, his strange selection of texts, along with a text from an obscure British Trotskyist and weirdly translated quotes ripped from socialist newspapers like the Socialist Review, prove he hasn't. If he did, he wouldn't have made this video. Again, I'm not commenting on the vote for Biden stuff, really. A genuine Marxist will decide whether or not to engage in bourgeois elections based on material conditions and in what way it will advance the communist movement. To me, it's absolutely ridiculous, as imperialism will still exist, and so will the bombs dropped on my country. Trump or Biden, it makes little difference to me as an Iraqi. But I'm not so arrogant as to claim I fully understand the American situation. I fundamentally don't, since I lack the lived experience of an American. This is a conversation between American comrades that I'll observe, simply. My only humble addition, let's say, is sure, if you feel it'll be better to vote for Biden, do so. But this should not be even 8% of your political work. Go and organize in your communities, develop people's power. We have countless examples from history. We have examples from within the US itself. Always educate, agitate, and organize. Voting for this bourgeois politician over that bourgeois politician should not be the end-all and be-all of your political action. In fact, it should be an afterthought more than the principal question.
In summary, after having extensively peruse the writings of the original theorists on the subjects of electoralism, participation in bourgeois electoralism, the support for reformist and bourgeois political parties when it serves the tactical interests of the left, and the necessity for leftists to carry their fight against bourgeois democracy and not against fascism, I have come to the definitive conclusion that the original perspective of the theorists who have been used as a weapon against me for my entire career align concretely with my perspective on this issue.
After having extensively perused the writings, calm down, buddy. You looked at like 4 works, more than half of which I'm convinced you didn't actually read, and just selectively quoted from an article you ripped off of Socialist Review or other similar sources. This doesn't change the fact, however, that misquoting Marx and Lenin in order to suit his strange agenda is not only dishonest, it's just wrong. If you get anything from this video, it's please, go read those works yourselves. You'll see how Vaush twisted them, as well as learn the real perspectives of the great theoreticians of the past. Take them as a guide, not a dogma. Feel free to disagree or not. Just read them with an open mind and hopefully everyone will gain a little.
Tankies are not Marxists. Tankies are not Leninists. Tankies are people who benefit from your ignorance of the writings of both of these people. Tankies will still say that I am misquoting them. Tankies will still say that by participating in bourgeois political parties, Lenin actually meant someone slightly to the left of Biden. I have actually read the theory that you haven't, and have now arrived at conclusions that you are uncomfortable with. I'm sorry. Maybe you shouldn't have asked me to read theory, because I wanted to play video games last night, but here I am, and now I know more.
A side note, Vaush keeps up this strange, smug attitude of, oh, look, the tankies don't read the theory because I have now read all the theory and found that they all support my position. Short of there being no definition of what a tanky is besides anyone I don't like, the thing is, though, he's wrong. He's not quoting these within the correct context, and the quotes themselves refute his positions. He's just too blinded by his personal position to see that. Marxism is a lifelong study, not something you can do in a few hours the night before.
But I'm not done. Because even if I was wrong about everything else I just said, I'm still right.
As a little postscript, after I finished writing this, I noticed that Band Empanada made a video on this exact same topic as well, so go check his video out. The link will be in the description. And that's all for this time. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Princess Charlotte, William Hargis, Alex Dexheimer, Comrade Saul, Hugh Jazz, haha, you probably thought you were very funny, Big Dummy Jack, Anarcho-Marxist, Richard Scott Wigton, Lee Gloucester, JC Diaz 543, Faisal Hussain, Ryan Hodgkinson, Semian Sarkar, Annex Magnus, Patrick Mansouri, Felipe Corrales, Deep Teeth, Jenny Enox, Comrade R, Alexander Shendi, Wild Bill, Brandon Vergara, John Edward Carrion, a comrade, at Southern Marxist, Close Sniper, Colin Moran, Because Butts, Alex Bookbinder, Alex Benishek, Comrade Goat, D. Lang, Darius A. Birdhall, John Bernstein, John Poland, No L, Nobody, Paul Luders, Pauline McDeasy, Rocco, Rose Hodgkinson, Scott Radburn, Alan Plum, Andy Haywood, Brian Persuade, Coach Cinnamon T, Comrade Benito, Comrade Pengu, Daryl McFarlane, El Juantin, L.A. Garzon, Eugene Simonovsky, Ferret Tahan, Garlic Bread, Grammar Antifa, Granola Joe, Industrial Robot, Wes, Shongzhao Hu, DV Gold Gamer, Jaden, Philistakes, Job, Spooky Scary Socialist, a Jordan Follows, Khan, Kyle Rapp, Liam Sipanan, Libertarian Stalinist, Mass Strike Now, Matt, Michael Reddy Webster, Namaratha Prabhu, Natalia Taylor, Omar Abdi-Jabbar, Parker Cushing, Ring, Rudy, Sid Singh, Sussy M, Ted Teddington Tedsville, Toki Mukai, Tristan Druyan, Veraldor, Zatarani, and Zarin Arsin. I'll see you in the next one.